Israel. As I normally come here and I spend much more time than this trip, as I was able to come in and I have to fly back out. And then I will see you all again in Barcelona. To follow up on Yael in his talk is talking about brand, and IBM has been very focused on talking about what we view as the smarter planet, and this concept of observations we've made over the years of what's happening relative to the overall marketplace, and then the role that we see IBM playing and the role that we see our clients as well as a broad ecosystem of players playing in the smarter planet. And what we've come to see is the role of communications, the role specifically of networks, and the operators of those networks becomes critical in our view of the ability for our clients and for other enterprises to move towards this concept of smarter planet, to become more intelligent, to become more interconnected and instrumented as we see that playing out, and being able to deliver greater value to their clients as well as find a way in which to capture value and deliver returns to whatever constituents or stakeholders that they have. As we think about, as IBM thinks, we always start and think about the macro trends that we see and how that then impacts what we're focused on. And we have noticed and we've looked at the role that spend plays, and we've looked at the telecommunication market, which roughly follows the IT spend as well. But this is looking at IT spend over the last decade. And you know, a critical aspect of this is that it has moved from an IT spend where it was growing at multiples of what we view as GDP to now sort of roughly in line with GDP. And we've seen some major hiccups in the marketplace, notably the dot-com bust of the early in the decade, and then the financial crisis and the challenges we've had over the last few years really kind of shook us up and shook the industry up to really take a look at and see, you know, how the industry is restructuring, what the impact of globalization has on industries and on our ability to create value for our industries. But it still kind of is very much aligned with what our strategic focus is, which continues to be at this delivering value to our customers by looking at the intersection between business and technology and helping drive innovation. It is looking at it from the perspective of where growth is coming from and being very focused on moving and investing into areas that we see growth. So much as the Israeli high-tech sector is very externally focused from a market perspective, IBM has become very focused on markets where we maybe didn't have the presence that we had previously, or focused on markets that we see generating tremendous growth. So we've kind of refocused and invested in those marketplaces. And we also continue to look at the mix of our business and looking at driving the mix of our business to higher value. So it sort of looks at it and says from an industry perspective is to focus on where value is being created and move to that point in order to continue to, one, drive value to our customers, but also to be able to ensure return to our shareholders. Which led us to view is there are specific areas that we focus on, that we view and will invest in to drive growth. And they are around growth markets and shifting from the more developed markets that are growing at slower rates to where we see a lot of economic activity and economic growth, looking at analytics and having an observation that with the explosion of data and the need to be more thoughtful and intelligent about the decisions that businesses are making and seeing the value that comes out of that. We see a tremendous value from that perspective. We see this shift towards solutions. And we see this, we've had this observation for a long time, but it continues, that spend continues to shift to more of a solution focus rather than a point product or a technology only perspective. And then cloud computing being another one where we see a wholesale shift in the way people look at consuming services. This all leads us to kind of look at how that impacts IBM's strategy. Our strategy remains consistent in that we are constantly focusing on you know, open technologies and driving towards the higher value solutions, trying to avoid getting caught up in things that are going to be commoditized, where value or differentiation is not sustainable. We look at it to drive this concept around integration and innovation for our clients, and we seek to look at the world and operate within the world that we try and sell products and services and solutions to. So we look very much at the global labor pool, the production capability, and how that affects our ability to drive value. So it's not just about the markets, it's also about the way you operate. Which brings us to kind of where we're focused on and where we're investing. Again, in line with what we saw is where there is growth in spend and where there is growth in value. We look at it from the perspective of markets and looking at making sure that we're able to focus on new markets to drive growth while ensuring that we don't lose ground in our traditional markets. And then we also look at the offerings and seeing where we can enter new spaces. And so at the core of that is this construct around what analytics can enable and what cloud computing enables to drive towards this thought process of smarter planet, and how that can drive great value to not just IBM and our customers and the ecosystem we operate in, but into economic growth in society, in driving social services as well, quality of life. So as we think about the evolution of Smarter Planet, where we think about the world having been a series of discrete or distinct physical assets and physical places to distinct peoples and marketplaces and IT, to one that's far more integrated or interconnected. We talk a lot about the world being instrumented, interconnected, and more intelligent. And interconnected just doesn't mean connected via the web or connected via telecommunications, but it also drives towards this thought that the world truly is interconnected, and what happens in one market absolutely affects what happens in others. We see this continuing to evolve and more of an interdependent view, more of a virtual world kind of playing out. So the world is not just interconnected, but it also becomes far more interdependent, and we need to look and understand how behavioral models affect the marketplace and how we can drive value, as well as looking at other aspects of things as it drives forward. So a major trend that we have been tracking to, and that I think everybody tracks to, is what's happening to our business from the perspective of what our core is, and our core is traditionally been computers, and looking at where and how they're managed and how they're deployed, and it rapidly we see that they're moving out of the data centers, and that's a very important trend for us all to be concerned about, because as environments and computing and storage and workloads are more and more distributed, there are all sorts of challenges that go with that relative to how do you manage those, how do you ensure the delivery, the quality of service, or the quality of experience of those services, how do you drive value out of the fact that they are very distributed, and being able to interpret and drive insight from the data that's generated from those points to drive towards this thought of the Internet of Things. And we talk in lots of sort of the policymakers around the world, and academics are talking extensively about this construct around the Internet of Things. It's been around for quite a while, the tagline, but what we're seeing is sort of very rapidly moving towards this thought of what the Internet of Things is. And the Internet of Things is something that, when we look at it, is much larger than the Internet. When we think about the Internet and the number of websites that exist and the number of websites that will be projected, compared to when we think about the number of things that will be connected as we go forward, whether they are connected through a subscription or connected just through a non-subscription based model. We're going from talking single-digit billions to tens of billions to hundreds of billions, and some people project out trillions in the relatively near future, like in the next 5 to 10 years, seeing the number of connected devices just astronomically growing at exponential rates, and the implications of that on us. So one of the things is it drives a great deal more ability to collaborate and drive from the perspective of how do these machines or these things and the people that are connected to these things collaborate? How do we orchestrate and drive out services in a way that help people accomplish and help enterprises accomplish what they're trying to drive towards? It also drives across, again, a tremendous amount more of data, and questions as to where do you actually process and interpret and drive insight from that data? How do you drive insight from that, and how do you then modulate or balance the need to process data as close as possible to the decision point or to the user versus trying to derive true insight out of trends and more of a holistic view of things. So we talk a lot about those two aspects of things, is the need to collaborate and orchestrate the services that are delivered or the value that's created, and also then kind of taking a step back and looking at how do we derive insight, how do we automate then those insights, and how do we make sure that the design relative to what we're looking at continues to play out. Which kind of brings us to this thought around, the Internet of Things is very much about the sensors and actuators that are being deployed in the world. Everything from, putting sensors into water systems to measure pressure, to ensure that, faults can be avoided, to, putting sensors and actuators into cars so you can measure things like traffic flows and congestion, and look at how do you optimize the operation of cars to ensure efficiency and lower pollution. There is an interconnected aspect, and then we have to look and think about the models and the analytics that go along with that. This all puts tremendous pressure on the infrastructure, the compute infrastructure, or the IT infrastructure as we traditionally think of it. And we include in that thoughts about the servers and processors that are required, the storage that's required, as well as the networks that connect everything together. And the way we think about that and the pressure that puts on the system is quite tremendous, so that when we think about what the value of cloud computing can bring is it starts to help address issues like the growth in data and information and the need for storage, and that it continues to explode. And how do you handle those capacity requirements and that massive growth of data? When we look at the fact of how we maintain and what we're able to invest in and what we're having to spend money on, and that fully 70% of all that we spend is really on maintaining the status quo as opposed to looking at how do we invest and drive new capabilities. It is really on just keeping what we do going and making sure that we're able to deliver on what we do today as opposed to looking to the future. And then when we look at this construct, if we think about the distributed nature of the Internet of Things as processors and storage get more and more distributed, and the need to continue to drive towards an optimization around peak volumes and peak traffic, there's a real challenge relative to how do we manage the capacity that we have as more and more cycles become idle on average, but in their peaks or in their spikes, they're actually required in order to handle all of that. So how do we manage the infrastructure that we've distributed? And thinking about it it really comes back to how do we optimize the capital that we're deploying into this compute infrastructure. So when we think about computing or cloud computing, IBM, and I think now basically the world or the industry is thinking about it in terms of changes in consumption and delivery patterns. Basically, it's a shift from the way, shifting in the way that our customers are buying and consuming services, and that puts pressure on then the way we deliver them. And it looks more towards standard approaches to things like service catalogs, looking at self-service models, looking at flexible pricing or usage-based pricing as opposed to outlays for servers or software licenses. It also looks at the challenges of driving towards achieving economies of scale by being able to optimize and virtualize across environments and then drive utilization up, because you're able to drive workloads to the most appropriate or the available cycles that you have, and being able to drive from that perspective. So virtualization, automation becomes critical, self-service becomes critical, and there are various different deployment models that we look at as well, relative to private clouds versus public clouds, and then sort of the mixture, the hybrid approach. And when we looked at cloud, and we've been watching cloud, cloud started off in a way that's somewhat analogous to the internet, and that it started off. It was sort of something that we saw as changing the economics of IT and helping companies look at the way they delivered and improve the capabilities that they drove and take cost out. Much as what we saw with the internet, as when the internet came about, it was able to kind of give people new capability to interact and to publish and get information out. The similarity between the two approaches is that the true impact of the internet didn't occur until it actually started to change the way businesses operated, change the way people interacted. Same with cloud computing now. What we see happening is within industries and within companies, cloud computing enabling them to change fundamentally the way they operate, to give them new capabilities, to change the way or change their ability to collaborate within an industry. So we see kind of tiering going on where cloud computing is being applied by whole industries to drive collaboration, to drive greater capability, as well as individual companies within an industry to drive differentiation and greater value from that perspective. This then, pulling it back to the communications industry and looking specifically at mobile or cellular, is that it puts tremendous pressure again here, because as we see all of this coming about, we see tremendous pressure from the growth of data that is traversing the networks, from the number of devices that are hitting the network or that are now connecting to the network, and we see that continuing to grow. And let alone the fact that we're approaching 4 billion cell phones in the world, and continuing to grow that rate as more and more people opt into it and more people have multiple devices. We also see this phenomenon of machine-to-machine continuing to play out. And machine-to-machine isn't just subscription-based machine-to-machine connections, which still is relatively small, but it also kind of expands out to look at various different sensors and actuators. It changes as we look at the way people use mobile and leverage it from the mobile cloud perspective, and the way they're looking at this to drive value from the perspective of allowing employees or allowing workers to be more mobile. If we think historically about the model is like mobile, the worker was mobile, the desktop was not mobile. So the way they accessed information or the way they accessed capability wasn't mobile, but the employee could move from desktop to desktop or terminal to terminal. Then we introduced laptops, and it sort of improved on that model. It got closer, but it still wasn't there. But now as we see the movement to smartphones and tablets, we see very much more of a one-to-one relationship between the worker and their device, the consumer and their device, where they're able to have a far more personalized experience than they did historically, which drives us to kind of the behavior of people who are consuming, or the people that are using these services, whether it be enterprises in the way they drive, to the consumer in the way they interact with each other as well as interact with businesses, putting a real challenge on the business models or the types of services that the cellular providers or the mobile network operators have traditionally delivered. And really forcing you to think about what the business model is and how you participate in those models. All this kind of, from an economics perspective, drive towards a need to manage capacity, to optimize the capital that's being deployed. If we think about where the industry is and the modeling that we've been able to do is the amount of spend on the wireless infrastructure, specifically on the core and the access networks. About a quarter of it each year is spent on just handling the growth in data traffic. And that goes everywhere from base stations that need to be built out all the way back through SGS, the GGSNs, and out into the various different aspects of the network, whether it be from a perspective of driving video optimization or CDN or caching into the network. It all kind of flows around that and drives tremendous pressure on the operators to continue to invest in not in new capability, but just handling the traffic. Which all comes back to this thought around the data profitability channel. As we see the traffic increasing and we see the increased need for spend on the network to handle that traffic, there isn't a like rise in the amount of revenue that they're able to glean from this new traffic. So the participation in the ecosystem revenue that is flowing out of all these new services has been lacking, or the industry has not been able to capture that. And others, players coming in from over the top, have been far more successful at driving value to the customer, and also capturing that value relative to the value in the chain. So as we look at this, there's a transition to smarter networks, and there are a number of different things that are going on that offer real opportunity for operators, and as suppliers to the industry, we need to think about how we then help with that. And the first thought is data becomes king. And the thought there is the networks are being re-architected and will continue to be re-architected from voice optimized to data optimized. And that offers a true opportunity for the network operators to change the proposition in what they can do and how they can bring in value into the network. It changes the economics of what they're doing as well as the capabilities. It's looking at driving what we traditionally think of as wireline internet type of capabilities into the wireless network, thinking about things like caching, thinking about things like CDN or video optimization, and driving them into the wireless network to help optimize, to help deal with the traffic that is flowing across, so that they're able to, in effect, drive greater quality of experience as one point. Two is to avoid the massive capital expenditures that are required to handle the traffic by more intelligently applying processing or delivering and handling workloads at given points in their infrastructure in order to avoid that. And then the third area is to think about how they can potentially position and derive greater value out of the network so they can create higher value services, which leads to the thought around movement to all IP and the opportunity that leads the industry to actually move into greater economics and the ability to leverage the economics of the IT industry in what they're driving to and looking to take advantage of, down into this thought around being more application focused as opposed to network focused. We still need the network orientation and the network optimization plays coming in, but we need to marry it with sort of this application aware to not just understand the class of the service or the protocol that the service is operating under, but also understand as we look at things in the network and do things like packet inspection, is to actually drive to and have a greater understanding of the content of the packet as opposed to just the class or the protocol. So as we look at it and think about it as an industry, there are many different opportunities that we see the high-tech industry being able to participate in. And starting with the concept of the world is moving towards this machine-to-machine and Internet of Things, and that there's tremendous opportunity for us to deliver value, to help create value for the industry, to this thought around this movement towards more and more IT types of technologies, as well as the economics of the broader IT world being applied into the telecommunication networks, and specifically into the wireless networks, is of tremendous value. But then we look at focusing on what are the actual services that people will be consuming, and how that drives and how that impacts the way business is conducted, the way people interact and live their lives. To then how do we start to look at how do we commercialize this, and that's everything from service delivery platforms to app stores to how we drive commerce, getting to the point of thinking about data and data models, and finally thinking about the actual programming models are changing very rapidly with the advent of things like HTML5 or HTTP Live. Streaming is really changing what we're able to do and the economics of what we're able to do, but it also puts tremendous pressure on us as traditional suppliers to change with the industry and make sure that we stay out in front as to how services are developed, which then can take advantage of the new infrastructures that are playing out. All this kind of leads to this thought about, as we change the networks, what we're able to do from a smarter planet perspective changes with it, and to be able to drive value to things like smarter cities, where we can drive greater public safety types of applications or traffic management applications, to healthcare and how we deliver healthcare services, and how we can improve collaborative care or do better monitoring of patients, or drive efficiencies into the healthcare system, or looking at it from a utilities perspective and how we understand the management of the distribution and transmission, the generation, and the consumption of energy, and the value that we can bring from that. All requires a smarter network, where we're not looking at a completely centralized model anymore. We're distributing the processing throughout the network and taking a look at how that can play. So it's no longer about applications sitting in data centers. It's looking at distributed function throughout the infrastructure. Examples are like with automotive and how we look at that, and the various different complexities that are required in order to drive value to the automotive industry relative to, you know, managing traffic again, or personal services that are delivered, entertainment type services, to how you actually maintain the car and ensure that the car is working at full efficiency. To looking at the home and how this then plays out in the home and what capabilities you drive at the home. It's not just about smart meters, it's not just about entertainment, but it is bringing a whole host of capabilities to the home. And a key challenge there is how do we manage the complexity of just installing and implementing and bringing this up, because there's a lot of retrofitting that goes on relative to this, but the value that can be brought to the home, to the intelligent home, is quite significant. And then we think finally about a broad thought, and it goes back to branding and branding of countries. You can also think about it from a city's perspective, and we see around the world cities being very competitive in trying to drive and attract business, to attract investment, to attract people, and looking at how they drive economic growth, how they improve the quality of life, deliver greater social services, and how do they do this in a most efficient way. And what is required to do that is a whole host of different types of services, from transportation to public safety to education to healthcare. And looking at these is they all benefit and require communications and sort of thought, and looking at how do I process and interpret data, how do I drive insight and then automate automate the actions that will be taken based off of that insight. And we can look at everything from, you know, transportation systems to energy management, water management being a critical one. And we look at this as a whole and see that cities are becoming a nexus for this type of innovation and driving this. And cities are going to become very competitive relative to the world. At times we very much believe that it's going to become more important than nations in driving this, depending on the environment. But if you look at the US, you know, cities will become competitive with other cities. If you look at China, China is a great example where the provinces are the key point of competition, and then the cities within them. But they are very competitive relative to driving innovation and improving and attracting investment and driving improvements in quality of life. And when we think about the construct around all this information and what we need to derive from it is one is to be able to move from more reaction to predictive nature and to drive towards more of an automation, and looking at how we push this insight further out so we can make decisions faster and then act on them faster to drive greater value, as well as looking at how this all fits into a broader value chain or broader ecosystem of players. So when we think about, you know, management of processes and optimization of those processes, you know, we come in and think about all the different aspects that are required in order to drive that out, and we start thinking about how we deploy that and where do we manage the events, how do we deal with the complexity of those events and the way we process them, and start to link them into a cycle or a view that allows us to address the entirety of the loop as we drive value. And then we look at it from the perspective of driving insight and how we can really drive towards this interconnected and interdependent models, which doesn't just say it's enough to position sensors and actuators and gateways out in the environment and then act on them as the data flows through them. We also have to be thoughtful enough to be able to pull back and think about and detect the various different patterns and models that are evolving so that we can do better design relative to the whole process as well. So we do think about things like assimilation and interpolation and then drive towards simulations and decision models and get to the point where we can think about, you know, what are the trade-offs of a decision when we're not operating with full knowledge, you know, which is more and more of the world is driving towards this ambiguity that we deal with. We have to make decisions and we have to drive them out, but we need to do that with the most insight that we possibly can have. Which brings us to the thought around ecosystems. And this is something that has been we've been working on for a while is that we absolutely see a change in the way we look at ecosystems. And cities is sort of one of the smarter cities plays that we've been engaging in, has really caused us to think quite differently. And I think that the challenge for us all is to think about where we sit in these ecosystems as they change. When we think about a city, well, when we traditionally thought about our ecosystem, we thought about, we engaged various different software vendors, we engaged systems integrators and various different makers of other technologies that were related to what we do. And today, now we're reaching out and looking at, well, there's wholesale infrastructures that are being built, and we need to work with the people that run those infrastructures. We need to deal with the designers of those and the engineers around those infrastructures and the people that build them. So our whole thought around what our ecosystem is and how we interact in that ecosystem and the role we play in that ecosystem has changed in order to drive value and to take advantage of all this. So as we think about it, there is a step back for us all to think about where we fit and how we fit and drive value from that perspective. And within the mobile business environment or the ecosystem, we think about it in terms of, there's the devices and applications on one side, and on the other side is what the services are that enterprises consume, and then in the middle are the actual network operators or the service providers that drive that out. And each one plays a different role. The roles are overlapping. We have to learn how we work together and where we drive value and who we focus on when we create value. So, when you look at it and say, well, we're going to deliver value or attempt to deliver capability across the value chain, we need to be very much aware of who those players are and what value they're seeking to drive, how we can then take a step back and deliver value there too. As we look at it, devices continue to drive a lot of this growth as the number of devices and the spend on devices continues to grow. The amount of IT spend in the infrastructures, this isn't looking at what it costs to build out the mobile networks or the wireless networks. This is talking about where spend is occurring from a IT perspective, but we still see that devices are continuing to drive this and have tremendous impact on the business. And now I'd like to just close with the thought again about this whole thing kind of playing out similarly to the internet, where we saw it's the browser wars, now it's the device wars. In the early days it was all about the browser, just as now it's all about the gadget, but in the end it's really about the money. It's where businesses will be spending and how this changes the way they operate and how they deliver services to their customers, how they interact internally in the processes they drive, how they interact externally in the processes they drive. So that's sort of the closing thought and how we think about this world, the communications market and the technology market driving and supporting the mobile, or driving and supporting the smarter planet. So I'd like to take questions, if there are any. Yeah.
Thank you, Joseph, for this presentation. So, using your global view, and as we all know, you have offices around the world. You have a global perspective. What does Israeli high-tech mean to you? A vice president of global strategy at IBM, what first comes to mind when you hear Israeli high-tech? Just give us some context.
Well, much of it is around, it is communications, it is software. It is also looking at sort of the constrained environment that Israel sits in and then looking at the innovation that's been driven there. Not necessarily, sometimes it's hard to kind of relate directly to high tech, but things like, agriculture and irrigation, when you look at energy and water management, those are things that I think that we look to leadership to Israel. We look at healthcare and communications as points of leadership and look very heavily towards the marketplace. We look for new technologies, new ways of doing things that are eminently adoptable, that do move to the mainstream. And I think that I'll kind of put up a number of them that are just focused in the mobile and the communications market. And that's why IBM is so focused on Israel, and we make such a strong investment and establish and maintain such a strong presence here. And we also think that it is very important that Israel is one of the places where the innovation that you drive is not driven solely towards a home market, whereas most countries that we see around the world are very focused on their internal markets or their existing markets first. They try and prove it out, they try and capitalize or monetize it, and then they look externally. Whereas Israel, much of the innovation is driven with the greater world or the broader world as its driver.
We don't have time for questions. I'm sorry.